Okay, I think we can get going. Dona, I'll be heading over the mic to you and then share a little bit more information about PractiTest at the end for everyone. But mostly they come to hear you, so I'll hand over the mic to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's during holidays for lots of people and time off, so I really appreciate people making the time to come and invest in, honestly, themselves. I am Dona Sarkar. I lead the accessibility tech team for Microsoft. I have been with the company for 17 years. And today I would love to share with you some of the things I've learned, not just at Microsoft, but also through running my own business. I run a fashion line called Dona Studios. We're attempting to be the most inclusive fashion line in the world. And I would love to share with you some of the design and testing principles we think of when we build product, either on my team at Microsoft or in my fashion line. So today we're going to be talking about how to design and delight for 8 billion humans. Okay, so first thing you're going to see is I have captions on at the bottom of my PowerPoint. I'm using PowerPoint. This is a setting that's available to everybody. You can just go up to the top ribbon under the item that says accessibility and just turn captions on. You can turn them on in any language, but I just have them on in English because I know not everyone understands my accent. Some folks might be hard of hearing and some may have focus issues where they prefer to listen and see at the same time. I don't know if you know, but captions usage in movies and TVs have gone up, I think 600%. 3 in 4 Gen Z people, they prefer captions on all video. It just helps them focus better. And it's something that they've gotten quite used to. Captions also helps people learn to read in another language or first language earlier. So I tend to always turn them on. Okay, story time. About a decade ago, I used to work on the HoloLens program at Microsoft. This is the mixed reality, augmented reality device. It's a Windows 10 device, you run it on your head. We were doing a partnership with JPL NASA at the time. And astronaut Scott Kelly, who you're going to see here on the screen, was spending a year on the International Space Station. We were working with him on this HoloLens project where Ground Central Houston could give him instructions on repair that they needed to do on the space station that he could just see through the device. Because it's a mixed reality device, it'll project holograms on various surfaces. Houston could say circles specific areas where, you know, a screw needed to be turned or like something needed to be moved. So at night, we had terrible insomnia on this team. We used to watch all of the, you know, sort of bugs and issues coming in from our various customers. And it was such an exciting project that we would stay up late night till 2, 3 a.m. talking to our various customers because they were all around the world. And at night, astronaut Kelly would send us these beautiful images of the Earth as seen from space. So one of the most interesting things to me was there were always lights. No matter what time of the day, he would send us images, there's lights from about half the planet. And looking out at those images, it brought home to me so clearly how big this planet is. And when we look at it just one segment at a time, we don't feel like we have a full grasp on everyone who lives on this planet, who we share this planet with. At any given time, we're deeply focused on probably 1,000, 1 million, or 1 billion people. But when you multiply that by 8 and look at the entire cross-section of Earth, it can get a little overwhelming to think about how are all those people using my product? How are all those people finding my product or my service? Now, Microsoft, of course, is a global company. We always think about the global audience when we're shipping a product. Like Windows 10, the operating system I worked on for a long time, it powers over 1 billion people. I think there's 1.3 billion people who use it in their jobs and their lives. So we know the reach, but just that year that I spent looking at pictures of space, looking at pictures of Earth from space, it made me realize we as a company, Microsoft, and whenever I start a business, I don't automatically think toward a global audience. I tend to think toward my audience and then scale it to a global audience. So that's when this idea of inclusive product development started coming to me about a decade ago. And I would ask myself the question, how would X humans find or use my product? And for any of you who work in testing, this really applies, because you think about the testing you do and how you can scale the amount of testing you do to account for people we might consider edge cases or corner cases, but in their case, in their context, they are the majority. They don't think they're a corner case. So I've been asking myself this question for about a decade, and I've formulated a framework by which I can work through this without it being overwhelming. So the first topic I'll touch on is accessibility. I now lead the accessibility team, the tech team at Microsoft, so this comes to me first. But for about a decade, this was one of those topics where I just didn't know a lot about. So I had to get very educated, and I'd love to share with you some of the things that I've learned over the past 10 years that were honestly pretty surprising to me. First, there are over 1 billion people worldwide with disabilities. There's probably over 1 billion because there's many parts in the world, Asia, Africa, South America, where talking about disability is quite taboo, especially if it's invisible, meaning a mental health concern or neurodiversity. People just don't talk about it. They don't get diagnosed, they don't get treated, they don't go out and share with everybody. So when we think about people with disabilities, it is those you think of, folks who might be blind, folks who might be deaf, folks who might be in a wheelchair. But it's also the people who may not know themselves or may be diagnosed later in life, such as people who are losing their vision. So pretty much anyone who wears glasses or has, contact lenses. People who are colorblind. If there's any men watching, 1 in 12 of you are colorblind. And many men don't even realize that until later in life. It just wasn't a thing that we tested for when we were younger. And now many men, when they go to a job, or a lot of people go attempt to register for the military, and they find these things out. The next is hard of hearing and deaf. We know people who are deaf, but do you know how many people are hard of hearing? Yesterday in the US, the Federal Drug Administration just passed this ruling where we could now sell hearing aids over the counter. This means that companies, startups, businesses can go out and make hearing aids for the general population, because right now to get fitted for hearing aids is extremely expensive. It could be $6,000 per hearing aid. Now, what's very fascinating to me about hard of hearing is it's not just much older people. There are people who are my age, people who are your age, who might be deaf in one ear. They've lost their hearing because they listen to loud music. They used to sit next to a speaker. They had an accident. They were born this way. Hard of hearing, because it's almost invisible, we don't even realize how many people are affected by it. A lot more than you think. I'm going to skip cognitive for a second and go to speech. Speech disability is something that might be a speech impediment, meaning someone who might speak with, kind of slower speed or hesitant speed, or it might be somebody who speaks through an interpreter or speaks through a device in some way. This has happened to people who've had accidents, have lost access to their voice box. I've heard of a few cases like this, and it's a very fascinating thing to see how they use typing to speech. Mobility, of course, when we think of people who might use wheelchairs, people who might use walkers, people who might use all those wheel devices, but it might be someone who has arthritis, someone who might have carpal tunnel, as many of us do with age, bad posture, etc. The last two topics I'd like to talk about are cognitive and neural. This is what I call brain stuff, okay, technical term, neurodiversity and mental health. These are the most unknown areas of disability. There's so much we don't know about the brain, but so much of this stuff can be helped or hurt by technology. I myself am dyslexic, so when you see a string of letters and words, those are mixed up for me. Those word games and puzzles that say, mix up a bunch of letters and say, I bet you can still read this paragraph. That's just what my world looks like in general. Other neurodiverse people might be folks who have ADHD. Some might be on the autism spectrum. There are lots and lots of neurodiversities that are getting diagnosed every day. Dyscalculia, people who struggle with numbers. Dysgraphia, where the actual writing that someone does might be skewed in one direction or the other. There's a lot of these that are being diagnosed, mostly again in the US, Western Europe, Australia, Canada, but not in most of the world. And then the last one is, of course, mental health, which has affected 1 in 2 people on the planet for the last 2 years. This could be situational, a seasonal disorder. This can be a permanent thing like generalized anxiety. It can be a temporary thing that affects you on Wednesdays, like social anxiety. So there are so many things when you think of the umbrella of accessibility that I like to keep them in mind when I'm designing something. I'll give you some real examples in a bit. The next factor I think of when I'm designing is power and connectivity standards. So it is actually irresponsible for tech companies to assume that everybody that they work with are going to have internet connectivity or even consistent electricity. On the left, you're going to see a tweet from my colleague at Microsoft named Homalama Mohapi. He lives in Durban, South Africa, and they have been struggling with rolling blackouts and load shedding for the last, I want to say 3 years. I worked with him at Microsoft for about 2 or 3 years. And pretty much every week they have a power outage problem. And everybody in South Africa is incredibly frustrated by this because it's a very technical forward place. But given all of these power outages, they're just not able to use certain products. And for a company to think that everybody in the world is connected, even people you think would be connected, is irresponsible. So I'll tell you a real story. Years ago, 2016, I was spending a lot of time in Lagos, Nigeria, working with the local businesses there. Here I am, this on the right side of the screen. This is an image of us in a co-working space. Every day when we went in, we saw the locals, the Nigerian folk, come in with their laptops and plug them in immediately. We always wondered why, because we had power throughout the day. So we didn't quite understand why they would plug in their laptops and sit near the outlets right away. And around on day 3, the power went out completely. And they had 8 hours of battery life and we had 1, because they knew the power can go out at any time, and it does quite often. That was when we learned we couldn't use Microsoft Teams. The Teams product had just rolled out 2016. I think it was in early beta, early preview. It was a product that was designed so it would only work online. And by work, I mean not receive and send messages, but just be able to open the app. So back then, if you double click the app and you were not connected to the internet, the app would just close. Now, I found that very frustrating because I couldn't even see existing chats, existing notes, existing groups I was in. I said, how am I going to use this product when we can't even use it in this room where my team is present? So we gave a lot of feedback to the Teams team. And now, thank God, Teams does work when you don't have connectivity, which is very useful when you're on airplanes, for example. So power and connectivity standards. The third thing I think of are country, language, and culture. These are all, they're related, but not the same. Country is all about, is your product available in a specific country? And that tends to be a deliberate choice. On the right, you're going to see a blog post from the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith, saying Microsoft suspends new sales in Russia. Many businesses have done this recently. But even before, it was just a matter of, is it possible for your product to be available in X country? I run a fashion line, so I now understand that shipping to specific countries is very challenging or almost impossible. Someone in Cuba ordered a piece for me, and getting it to them was very, very challenging. It had to go through Canada, then it had to go somewhere else, then it had to go to Cuba. Second thing is language, and I'd like to tie in culture as well. Language is, of course, what languages is your product accessible in, available in? Did you translate to that language? What are the primary languages in that area? But culture, I think, is the most interesting, because as you think about testing and design, how will it be received in specific cultural contexts? So, for example, I spent a lot of time in Jakarta, and when I brought up the topic of mental health or neurodiversity, I would always raise my hand and say, I'm dyslexic. And I would describe what I do. People look shocked. They said, why are you talking about this? If there's something wrong with your head, you shouldn't talk about it. They didn't mean it in a bad way. It's just not something you talk about in certain societal constructs in Jakarta. I know that that's different now. Probably there's a lot more young people, a lot more talk about mental health and neurodiversity. But when I was there in mid 2000s, it was not a topic that was openly discussed. Race, gender. When we think inclusivity, we always go to race, gender, and it is definitely a factor. It's a complicated factor because, again, back to culture, where you talk about gender and pronouns in a place like the US, you maybe wouldn't do that in South America. A lot of people don't quite understand that. So when you're building a product, it's really important to factor in where your target audience is and what race, gender constructs look like there. When I'm working on HoloLens, one thing that was fascinating was the first version of the device didn't actually fit on my head. It would just fall through. And part of it was designed for a grown man who's 6'4". So a grown man 6'4" is going to have a much wider head than me. So once a lot of people on the team, not just women, realized that, oh, this device doesn't actually fit right, we went on a head measuring activity. We would take measuring tapes and go around and measure the heads of 100 colleagues, then 1,000 colleagues. We realized it's just not the circumference of the head. It's how long is the head this way? How long is the head this way? Heads are oval. Very, very interesting work. But even just measuring our colleagues' heads, we learned so much about how to adjust the device from a bunch of variety of ways. And that's the key. Make sure your product is adjustable for the social construct. When we were doing work with the HoloLens, we had to make sure that it recognized skin tones. It uses head tracking and cameras on the outside. You recognize a hand that's in front of you like this, has to recognize all different skin tones, whether very dark or very light. We learned that very light has to be seen against not a very light background. So we had to do a little bit of adjustment with the cameras. Fascinating. So age range and end of life. When we think age range and end of life, we tend to go toward younger generations. Like this product is only for ages 12 and up, over 18 and up. But what about that boundary of someone who might be an adult in the US, may have been an adult for 6 years in Europe? If we consider, adult to be 18 in the US, if you think about, I've spent a lot of time in various places in Asia, age of adulting there is 15. So it, again, comes back to the cultural context. I almost think about culture first, and then I factor in all these other things because so much of it depends on where and the culture of the people where. A topic that's been coming up a lot lately is end of life. What happens if it's morbid, if your customer dies? How do they stop subscribing to your service or product? How does it turn off? How do we protect their data? I found really interesting on Signal this setting that says, if away for X much time, delete all of this data. I thought that was pretty smart. I know a lot of email addresses do it, like we will automatically delete your email address if you're away for X many days. But I think it's really important for us to think about when we do product development, what does the end of life setting look like? Morbid, but it's a fact. And then, of course, economic condition and tech literacy. Economic condition and tech literacy are similar, but also not similar. On the left is my friend Samit, who used to work at Heathrow Airport in security. So he would work at what we call, where people would come take off their shoes, put their laptop in the bin. And he realized there's a lot of paperwork that has to happen. You have to look at the latest laws. And he said, I feel like there's a better way to do this. So he adopted the Microsoft Power Platform, which is our low-code platform, to solve some of this. Now, he will tell you, he's not a technical guy. He finished high school. He is dyslexic. He's never written code in his life. He's not super tech literate. But he was able to figure this out because he had to solve a business problem. We purposely built this product for people who do not come from a tech background. Many of the Power Platform customers are bus drivers. They used to run book publishing. They had a completely different job doing something in a nonprofit. They used to, fit windows on vehicles, all kinds of jobs that are non-technical. But The platform also caters toward people who come from a very technical background. And just thinking through the tech literacy angle, you really do have to figure out, who is this product for? Who is this already designed for, and who could it be designed for with some adjustments? Economic condition is also very interesting, where you think about, what is the most expensive thing this person can afford for a specific activity? The Gates Foundation published, they didn't publish these weird graphics I found on Paint 3D, but they published a blog article that I really liked, saying, what is the most expensive thing your target person can afford to commute in? Okay, is the most expensive thing they can afford a pair of shoes, a bicycle, or a car? So once you know that in terms of chunks of tech literacy and economic condition, you're able to say, okay, if the most expensive thing a person can afford is a pair of shoes, trying to sell them $600 software may not work, right? So it comes down to economic condition. So I've thrown at you a bunch of information. It can be overwhelming. Again, back to mental health, right? One of the things we don't want to do is overwhelm people with information that they're not going to remember. So I keep a pretty handy checklist. I actually just copied this checklist from a note page that I have near my work setup, because I just think about it. There's of course way more than these factors, but this is my top level thinking of how I go through an internal checklist when I'm designing a product or testing a product for Microsoft or my fashion line. So I'd like to walk you through 3 questions that I ask once I factor in once I think about I consider all of the people that might be using my product. I think about 3 questions. Who am I intentionally excluding? Now, there are going to be people you intentionally exclude with your product or service, and that is okay, as long as you know that. Like, for example, right now at Microsoft, we're intentionally excluding specific countries that cannot receive our products, either because we can't ship to them or because we just don't have a data center available. It's a very intentional activity. For my fashion line, I don't cater toward people under 12. It's an intentional exclusion. That is okay, as long as you know you're doing that. The second part is actually the most problematic, which is, who are you unintentionally excluding? On the screen is an image of my colleague, Ann Taylor, who's blind, showing the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, how to use Seeing AI. Seeing AI is something that uses Azure Cognitive Services to see the world around them and repeat back what they're seeing. Now, blind people are often left out of many technological things. You've heard me describe what you're seeing on the screen a few different times. That's to intentionally include folks who are blind, because I happen to know lots of people who are blind. So unintentional exclusion is where people get into trouble, because that's where people say, oh, I didn't even think about that. It's okay, but it's important that we learn. And this is really why I have this checklist. I just go through and think, am I unintentionally excluding people who have limited mobility? Am I unintentionally excluding people who have less connectivity, people who might not understand the cultural context of what I'm seeing here, people who, might have a slightly different tech literacy? Am I communicating in a plain language enough that people who do not have above, a grade 8 education can fully grasp what I'm saying and apply it to their life? So that unintentional exclusion is what tends to make people feel excluded, because they always felt like they should be included, but they weren't. I'm going the wrong way. And the third one is the action step. How can I shift left one step in my inclusion journey? Okay, it's pretty hard to go from, if you've never thought about inclusion, all the way to research. It's hard. So I think about it in terms of shifting left one stage. So if you've never thought about inclusion until your product's already out the door and you wait for bugs to come in from customers, think about it including more people in your testing phase. Think about doing a beta program that includes more people, that includes, different age ranges, different countries, different cultural contexts, etc. If you're already thinking about it at testing, think about it at the development phase. How can you factor in before your code even gets checked in? How can you think about these things? You know, if you're building an online product, how can you think about, oh, what would the offline scenario look like just at the coding phase rather than trying to fix it? The earlier you move inclusion earlier this way, the less expensive it is. If you factor in inclusion at research, you're going to spend maybe $100 per inclusive angle. If you think about it at deployment, fixing it costs about $10,000 per issue. So it's astronomically expensive to fix things after they've shipped. Much, much, much cheaper to fix it all the way at the beginning. But again, don't overwhelm yourself. You know, back to mental health. Think about how you can shift left one step. So I'd love to talk to you about Prima Donna, my fashion line. I've learned a lot at Microsoft, and it's been a joy to take all the principles I've learned about in software and hardware and apply them to a very physical product that people have an emotional attachment to their clothing, also to something I have to ship to places all around the world. We do strive to be the most inclusive fashion line in the world. We are not there yet, but we believe in progress over perfection. So I'd like to walk you through, this is a real chart of some early brainstorming I'd done with my business partner to think about how can we be more inclusive by design from the very beginning. People with disabilities. How are we factoring in people with disabilities? I have a customer who has a leg amputation, Marley, and she wants a pair of pants. Now, she has a very hard time finding pants that fit her because she does have a leg amputation, and she wants a pair of pants with one full leg and one pair of shorts. And it's hard for her to find some that aren't absolutely hideous, that are the zip-off kind. So we designed a pair for her. And because we do customs, this is very possible. So we ideated with her. We got together with her at the idea phase. I didn't do a lot of research before because I didn't quite know what she wanted. But at the idea phase, we figured out what textiles will work, what the length she would want of the shorter pants, what the shorter leg, what length she would want of the longer leg, etc. For power and connectivity, we think most people find us because they have connectivity. But if someone doesn't have a smartphone, for example, how would they find us? Have we thought about doing various pop-ups in cities when we travel and having a point of sale system? What if somebody doesn't have a credit card? That is a common thing. At Microsoft, this is a thing we run into quite a bit because for many of our services, you need a credit card. But there's many companies where that's not a common way to buy products. What happens in that case? I'm still working on that one. Country, language, culture. Middle East. Many of our fashion is not what we call modest fashion. It's not immodest, but no, you show arms, you show collarbones. And for many, many women in the Middle East, they prefer not to show that for various reasons. So I've started doing a line of modest fashion for folks who might live in the Middle East, folks who might just prefer more modest clothing for work, for life, for religious events, etc. Covers the collarbones, covers the wrists, covers the ankles, less form-fitted. This has been very successful. I was honestly surprised. We did the research, came up with some specs and some dimensions, shipped them. We've sold 150 of these without doing much work. Word travels. So I had quite a few Muslim women, quite a few folks from the Amish community, folks from the Mormon community, reach out and buy these pieces because they have lots and lots of social events, it turns out, and they want modest fashion in beautiful textiles that is not too revealing. Fascinating. Did not think of this until I brought in inclusion. Race, gender. I've gotten feedback from a few folks. We've always built clothing for women, for trans folks, you know, but I got feedback from someone who's gender neutral saying, I would love something that's not necessarily for shaped, that's not for men or for women, just for anyone, like a big tunic in your beautiful textiles. Our textiles that I collect when I travel really resonate with people. And they say, I just want a different shape that's not catered toward a specific body type. So we are right now in the idea phase of building something gender neutral. Age and end of life. Many of our younger customers are saying, hey, we want more sleeveless. Like, I appreciate you like sleeves, but I want to, wear sleeveless because I don't spend all day in an office. Like, oh yeah, not everyone spends all day in an office, freezing in cold temperatures. And then economic and tech literacy. Tech literacy doesn't matter as much, but economic condition does. I've had many people reach out that's saying, I can't afford one of your dresses, but again, I want something in your beautiful textiles. So we've started doing lower cost bags, just some lower cost pieces like shirts and hoodies and that sort of thing. So that is the grid. I want to walk you through a case study of a technical solution because that's probably more relevant to many of you. Imagine that I am a developer or a citizen developer, meaning somebody who comes from a non-tech background, but I'm building product, building an expense tracker application for my company. For people with disabilities, I would figure out, does this work for people with a screen reader? Does this work with just tabs? Does this work with voice dictation? For connectivity, I would figure out, how would this work offline? Because you should be able to upload your receipts without having to be online. Because when I'm traveling, when I get a receipt, I just want to take a picture right away and store it. I don't need to file the expense report, but I don't want to carry this receipt around because I will lose it. Country language, is it available for download in Russia? Is it available for download in Cuba? What about many other places? Is it available for download everywhere that we have employees? Race and gender, still thinking through that one. Age of end of life, is this for over 18 only or just for under 18? Do you have to sign a thing? I learned recently, we have high school interns and they have events and they need to file expenses. So I had to expand just the thinking to factor in employees only more than age or end of life. And then economic power and tech literacy. Tech literacy, we had to figure out, how can people learn to use this app without them having to read like a bunch of documentation? That's also relevant for people who are dyslexic or people who might speak another language. How can we make the documentation extremely simple and straightforward within the app itself? So these are the factors we've thought about when building just an in-house expense tracker app. I'm not going to go through all these, but an IT administrator deploying, not building a vacation tracking site would be, when you deploy, think about each country. What if interns are under 18? Where do you put the documentation again? How does this work hands-free for limited mobility? The third one, and I think this is pretty relevant, a project leader rolling out a mental health program for people with disabilities. What about people who have a diagnosed mental illness or a mental health condition? We don't want to interrupt a person's treatment with our own program. How can people opt out of this? And how can we ask that without it being like, you are not invited to the program? Connectivity, how can people get access to this when they're not connected? Because people may need, to have their meditation app or their meditation program available on an airplane when a lot of people get anxiety and the Wi-Fi connectivity is not available. Country language, mental health is a taboo topic in much of Asia. How do we roll this out there? With what language? Would we change our language from mental health to wellness, to be reducing stress? How would we change our language and think about it? Race, gender, we know men's mental health is a big topic. What are some topics we would cover without it being a big stigma, again, in many parts of the world? What does age and end of life look like? And then for economic power and tech literacy, we don't always want to say, if you hit this, go see a therapist. Because again, cultural context, therapy is not available everywhere in the world, nor is it easily available. We don't want to also assume enough economic power that everyone can go and get this therapy. What free options are available in local context? So I've thrown a lot of information at you for the last 35 minutes straight, but ultimately it all comes down to 3 questions that I would love for you to think about next time you're building or testing a product, which is, who are you intentionally excluding? Because it's okay to do that. Who are you unintentionally excluding? Because that's where the mishaps and gaps happen. And 3, how can you move your inclusion thinking back, shift left 1 phase? If you go on this journey and you run into questions or concerns, please get in touch with me. I do love to talk about it. I'm very findable on Twitter and LinkedIn under Dona Sarkar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dona. It was eye-opening, at least for me, I have to say. I think that we definitely don't take into consideration a lot of the scenarios that you just introduced, and especially, when bringing into the context of testing, when trying to emulate what problems user might have.
Yeah.
I do think that more often than what we'd like to think, we don't take people with various types of disabilities into the consideration, although they do play a significant portion of the population and they do deserve to be included.
Yeah.
I found it to be very, very eye-opening. I'd like to use this opportunity to thank you for this session. been very eye-opening, as mentioning, and thank everyone who joined us this evening or this afternoon or morning, depending where you are located, during the challenging time of mid-August. And if you're watching the recording, I hope you like it as well. You are invited to join our upcoming webinar as well. We're hosting at least once per month. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Talk soon. Bye.